begin with Tesla, because it appears that its year is getting worse, with its share price continuing to slide today, down another 4%. Its value has dropped by more than 40% since January, and European sales have plummeted while it's facing increased competition from China in particular. The main reason for the slump appears to be its boss. Elon Musk's move into the world of politics seems to have triggered a backlash.
Tesla investors are calling on Elon Musk to step down and give up control of the company. Now, investors usually don't care about politics or geopolitics, but they do care when it starts affecting their bottom line. Last few months, Elon Musk has been heavily involved in US politics, and on top of that, he has embedded himself in the foreign policies too. He has commented on the Russia-Ukraine war multiple different times, going as far as to falsely claim that Ukraine started this war, and even called for the removal of Zelenskyy, a democratically elected foreign president. Well, all his false comments about Zelenskyy are coming back to bite him. Tesla sales are dropping all over the world, but specifically in Europe, and in turn that's having a negative effect on Tesla's stock price. And this is exactly why investors are calling for Musk to step down. Here's more details.
We're seeing, on one hand, we've been making this point in the commercial break, what did investors expect to get for Tesla out of Elon Musk's relationship with the president?
Yeah, so two things going on. One is that Elon Musk has made this hard pivot away from the autos business towards what he calls full self-driving, robo-taxis. That business is very speculative, right? It's not clear when it's going to start to make money, when it's going to start to be real. They do not have a robo-taxi yet. The other thing that's going on is his political sort of antics in Washington is starting to alienate parts of Tesla's customer base. You think of a typical Tesla driver. This is like some upper middle class person who lives in the suburbs and cares about climate change, not necessarily likely to be impressed by like a, pot stirring social media troll. So I think there's some of that going on. You're seeing it more dramatically in Europe than in the US, but you are seeing it a little bit in the US too, it seems.
In Europe, Tesla sales are really hurting, and it has a lot to do with his comments about this Russia-Ukraine war. Europeans are a lot closer to Russia, so they realize the danger of appeasing a dictator like Putin and giving up on Ukraine. That means when Musk makes comments that are straight out of the Russian propaganda playbook, Europeans are turned off towards his brand, towards his Tesla company. Here's the perfect example of this. Here, Elon Musk is replying to a tweet that claims that Zelensky's approval rating in Ukraine is just 4%, and the 57% figure is from a company that's controlled by Ukrainian government itself. When in reality, this is just not true, but we'll get to that in just a second. Here's Elon Musk's reply. It should be utterly obvious that Zelenskyy-controlled poll about his own approval rating is not credible. If Zelenskyy was actually loved by the people of Ukraine who would hold an election, he knows he would lose in a landslide, despite having seized control of all of Ukrainian media, so he cancelled the election. In reality, he's despised by the people of Ukraine, which is why we have refused to hold an election. I challenge Zelenskyy to hold an election and refute this. He will not. I don't even know where to begin, but let's refute this all point by point. First, Elon Musk says that the 57% approval rating that Zelenskyy has comes from a Zelenskyy-controlled company. Now, that's definitely not true because Ukraine still has independent institutions even during martial law, even during an invasion. But let's just assume that's true. Let's assume for the argument's sake that Zelenskyy controls the polling company in Ukraine. So Elon Musk is basically saying we should believe the Russian propaganda that says Zelensky's approval rating is 4%, and we shouldn't believe the Ukrainian side that says Zelensky's approval rating is 57%. So Elon Musk is basically saying he's happy to believe Russian propaganda and not even question that Putin controls everything in Russia. Every single newspaper, TV channel, news channel is controlled by Kremlin. They basically get their talking points directly from Kremlin. And Elon Musk is saying that's more trustworthy than Ukraine, where they still have independent institutions. That brings me to my second point. Elon Musk says that Zelenskyy canceled the election in Ukraine, and that's not true either, because it was the parliament who voted in martial law because Russia was invading Ukraine. And because of the martial law, Ukraine cannot have elections. That's in their constitution. So it wasn't Zelenskyy. Even if I was the president of Ukraine, again, just making arguments, there would be no election because it's not the president who decides that there won't be an election, it's the constitution. If there's a martial law, there cannot be an election. Now, this is just one tweet of many that Elon Musk has put out attacking Ukraine, attacking President Zelenskyy, all the while not saying a single word about the dictator that Putin is. It was Putin who started this invasion. It is Putin who controls every single media in Russia. So if Elon Musk truly has a problem with someone controlling all the independent institutions in a country, maybe he should look at Russia. Dumb tweets like these are having a direct impact on Tesla's sales figure. Let's look at them. According to Zato, Tesla sold 18,000 cars in January 2024, but only around 10,000 in the same month in 2025, a collapse of 45%. This is Europe as whole. Germany's drop was particularly telling considering this is where Teslas are made in Europe, with 3,000 cars shipped in January 2024, falling to 1,200 in 2025, a 59% drop. France was even worse with a 63% drop in sales. Spain fell by 75% and UK by 18%. Now, I'm sure someone will comment this down below, so let me clarify this ahead of time. Usually, January is a low month when it comes to sales. That is why we're not comparing December sales to January. We're comparing January 2024 to January 2025 to basically adjust for this drop that usually happens, a seasonal drop. Now, these sales figures are directly having a negative impact on Tesla stock. It's clear that investors have been reading the negative European sales with concern. From a high of $484 in December, Tesla shares have dropped to $246, almost 50% drop. Now, investors usually don't care what Elon Musk does in his personal time. He can tweet about Russia, he can tweet about Ukraine, he can tweet about China. In fact, investors did not care one bit when Elon Musk partnered up with the CCP because sales figures were going up and the stock price was going up. Elon Musk's Ukraine comments are having a negative impact on the Tesla sales in Europe, and because of this, stock price is going down. So investors are calling for him to step down. Here's just one example.
I suppose my first question is this a crisis for Tesla?
Oh, it absolutely is. I mean, they have the best vehicles, electric vehicles out there. It is a fundamentally important company in dealing with climate change. The battery systems and the charging systems that they've built are top in class. And here the company's reputation is just being destroyed by Elon Musk. And sales are plummeting. So yeah, it's a crisis. You literally can't sell the best product in the marketplace because the CEO is so divisive.
To Elon Musk today?
Well, I think we all make choices with our time, and Elon doesn't get more than 24 hours a day just because he's Elon. So we make choices. All of us do. Do we spend time with our family? Do we go golfing? Do we work? And how we do this is, each individual chooses. And so Elon chooses to work, all the time, but you can only work so many hours a day. So that's 24, right? And he sleeps. So there's no question he's been committed to his job at the government. That's where he's spending his time. He is not running Tesla. And, that's why I'm going to say it. I think Tesla needs a new CEO. And I decided today I was going to start saying it. And so this is the first show that I'm saying it on. It's time for somebody to run Tesla. The business has been neglected for too long. There's too many important things Tesla is doing. So either Elon should come back to Tesla and be the CEO of Tesla and give up his other jobs, or he should focus on the government and keep doing what he's doing, but find a suitable CEO for Tesla.
Now, Elon Musk was definitely a very busy man even before he got involved with Doge and the US administration. He already had multiple different companies, including Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, X, which is basically Twitter, and XAI. Each one of them is a multi-billion-dollar company, so unicorns. But one problem with having so many companies and also dedicating so much time with Doge is you have to split up your focus, while your competitors are focused on one thing, beating you and making their company better. More specifically, the Chinese competitors that Elon himself helped give birth to when he went to China back in 2014. One of those Chinese companies that's been killing Tesla is BYD, and just a few days ago they had a groundbreaking announcement. They figured out a way to charge up a whole electric car in less than 5 minutes. For all of you guys who have been inside an electric vehicle, you know that's terrific. Here's the announcement.
In fact, we just took out the recent high is BYD. 4.5% at about 403. We're coming off highs a little bit, but I believe we should still be above the pre-cash call level there intraday. Let's bring in Daniel Lee to tell us really what's going on here and all the bullishness around the stock here. Tell us about this BYD event.
Yeah, so BYD, the investors reacting to an event last night, BYD showcasing ultra-fast charging cars, a whole new lineup of models that we based on much more powerful, robust batteries, but critically with super fast charging that basically gives you the same amount of range or power in 5 minutes in the same time it takes to charge a gasoline car. So it's a whole new suite of tech and infrastructure that BYD is banking on to really accelerate the sales of its fully electric EVs, particularly as it made upgrades to its plug-in hybrid models last year, and that itself saw sales soar. So this is a huge bet on them for them to try and really elevate sales even further.
Now, just for comparison, Tesla supercharging takes around 15 minutes to charge up the whole car. BYD has decreased that time by 66%. On top of this, BYD was already selling more cars than Tesla. In 2024 alone, BYD sold around 4.27 million cars compared to Tesla's 1.7 million. Now, many people don't know this, but China did not have a thriving EV industry at all. In fact, they didn't have anything that you can call an EV industry. Any small companies that they did have were dying. So that's why CCP lured in Elon Musk using free loans, free land, and cheap workers. Then they used up Tesla and Elon Musk to build up an EV industry that can now rival any car industry in this world.
As you guys know, over the last 2 weeks, few of our videos have been demonetized by YouTube for talking about sensitive topics and covering violent events. This is why recently we opened up memberships on the channel. This way you guys can directly support our content. Again, you don't have to do it, we'll continue making the videos, but if you enjoy the content and you're able to support us, you can do so by signing up for our membership. It costs less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks and it's greatly appreciated.
The future of clean energy seems to be in the hands of China, and no other country is even close to what China is doing.
The Chinese car companies are the most competitive car companies in the world. I think they will have significant success outside of China, depending on what kind of tariffs or trade barriers are established. Frankly, I think if there are not trade barriers established, they will pretty much demolish most other car companies in the world.
It scares me to say this, but if China continues on this path, and if the world doesn't do anything about it, almost every country will become dependent on China, and the control China would have is something no one could imagine. Well, this is what the facts say, at least.
As the world starts to turn away from fossil fuels, China is positioning itself as the king of clean energy, not only transforming its own energy system, but also building a supply chain that could leave the world uncomfortably dependent on China for its energy needs.
China has really expanded its grip, so it's the processing, it's the manufacturing, it's all the way down to your EVs and your battery packs.
China dominates over 80% of the manufacturing stages for solar panels, controls 58% of the global EV market, and has control of literally every part of the manufacturing process. In fact, 99% of the global production capacity is one of the key parts of solar panels, known as the Wafer, is located in China. China dominated the global solar energy market not for one, not two, but for 10 years in a row. And the story doesn't end here. The Chinese car maker BYD overtook Tesla as the world's top-selling electric car maker in 2023. And Chinese EV manufacturers are overtaking European EV manufacturers by storm. Even the investing goat, Mr. Warren Buffett himself, chose BYD over Tesla to invest $232 million in 2008, which grew to $8 billion as of 2022. But the by hook or by crook method of gaining market leadership has backfired severely. China has suffered significant repercussions and might continue to suffer in the future too. So in this video, let's understand three things. 1. How has China gained such an extraordinary dominance in the solar energy and EV markets? 2, how could this dominance become a huge threat to the world? And 3, what are other countries doing to break this dominance? Okay, let's begin. On the 12th of December 2015, during COP21, or the 21st Conference of Parties held in France, the Paris Climate Change Agreement was introduced.
A record number of countries signed the historic Paris Accord to slow global warming. China and the United States, the world's top producers of greenhouse gas emissions, pledged to formally adopt the deal by the end of the year.
This was finally done because emissions have reached dangerous levels. So much so that emissions after 2020 have more than tripled since the 1940s. This is the reason why 195 parties made up of 194 countries, plus the European Union, have signed an agreement to limit the temperature rise to just 2 degrees Celsius and possibly even 1.5 degrees Celsius. On top of that, the world will soon run out of fossil fuels. According to many research reports, if the world continues to consume these resources at the current rate, coal will last just for the next 114 years, oil for the next 51 years, and natural gas for the next 53 years. Also, developed countries like the US, Britain, Canada, and Japan have set their zero emissions targets by 2050. China has set it by 2060 and India by 2070. This is the reason why countries are focusing on renewable sources of energy for their energy needs. Now let's see why solar panels and EVs have a critical role to play in it, and how the Chinese government and Chinese companies worked together to gain extraordinary dominance in this space. Although, admittedly, this dominance has decreased, and it will continue to decrease significantly in the future because of the multiple steps other countries have started taking towards it. We will discuss that shortly, but before, let's see why solar energy is such a big deal. So, there are 5 major sources of renewable energy: hydropower, wind energy, solar power, bioenergy, and geothermal power. As of 2020, hydropower accounted for 54% of the global renewable power generation capacity. Wind energy with approximately 24% of the world's total renewable energy generation capacity, and with around 486 gigawatts of installed capacity, solar panels grab the 3rd spot. Now, you may ask, if hydropower and wind energy are already the bosses, then why is the world crazy about solar energy? And what is the problem with China being the biggest player in this space? It doesn't have that much to gain because the world already has the resources to produce energy from wind and water, right? And truthfully, even I was kind of thinking the same thing. But upon further research, I found some stats and figures that absolutely blew my mind. From 2015 to 2020, the annual growth rate of cumulative solar energy capacity has grown by an average rate of 25%, making it the fastest growing renewable power source in the world. According to the International Energy Agency, as of 2028, renewable energy sources are expected to account for over 42% of global energy generation, with energy generation from wind and solar together projected to double to 25% compared to 13% in 2023. So, the global solar panels market will keep on growing. It's expected to increase by tenfold by 2030 in order to reach the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement. Hydropower, on the other hand, has seen a decline over the years. The share of hydropower, which was once at 16.9% in the year 2000, has actually fallen to 14.2% in 2023, and is expected to keep falling to 13.9% by 2028. This is because of the dark side of hydropower.
As dams and reservoirs disrupt river ecosystems and surrounding habitats. And recent studies show that reservoirs can emit more CO2 and methane than previously understood.
Building a hydropower plant is expensive. It has several environmental consequences, and it is geographically dependent. For example, hydropower plants cannot be set up in the Sahara Desert because of a lack of water resources in the region. Solar panels, on the other hand, are eco-friendly, can be used anywhere, and can be harnessed in remote locations. They don't require much space, and most importantly, they are extremely cost-efficient. The costs of producing energy are also a big reason behind countries choosing solar energy. If we look at the average cost to produce energy from 2009 to 2019, we have some very interesting figures. In 2009, the cost of electricity from coal was $111 per megawatt hour. The cost from nuclear was $123 per megawatt hour. The cost from wind was $135 per megawatt hour. From solar, it was a mind-boggling $359 per megawatt hour. But a decade later, in 2019, these figures changed completely. And this is what it looked like. In 2019, the cost of electricity from coal dropped by just 3% to $109 per megawatt hour. The cost from nuclear increased 26% to $155 per megawatt hour. From wind, it dropped by 70% to just $41 per megawatt hour. And the cost from solar dropped by a huge extent to just $40 per megawatt hour. That is an 89% drop in price. Later, it even dropped to $37 per megawatt hour in 2020. These prices are expected to drop further as the demand for solar will keep growing and it remains a top priority for the majority of countries. In the case of EVs, the prices for 2023 have declined from 5 to 40% as compared to prices in 2022. And in the case of China, the prices have even halved during the last 8 years. Now, if you're curious about the huge price drop that happened, hang on, we'll get to the answer in a few minutes. By now, you know the reason why countries are doubling down on solar energy. And this is where China comes into the picture.
Now, China controls over 80% of the global solar panel supply chain and of the world's top 10 largest solar manufacturers.
When I mentioned earlier that China controls every part of the solar cells manufacturing process, I mean it. Just like every other product, a solar panel is made from multiple different components. Here's what a solar panel looks like. But to achieve this end result, it has to go through 4 key stages in the manufacturing process. First, metallurgic-grade silicon is turned into a material called polysilicon. This is later converted into cylindrical-shaped structures called ingots. These ingots are turned into silicon wafers, which later are then used to manufacture solar cells. And finally, multiple solar cells are arranged together to get the final product that we call a solar panel. The shocking fact here is that China controls not 1, not 2, but all 4 of these critical stages of solar panel manufacturing, to such an extent that no one could have imagined. Firstly, when it comes to metallurgical-grade silicon, China controls almost 71% of the production in the entire world, with other players like Russia contributing around 7%, and the United States, Brazil, and Norway each producing 4% of the silicon. And these numbers are nowhere near what China is doing. And the next stage, when it comes to manufacturing polysilicon, China controlled 79% of the market share in 2021, which later increased to 86% in 2022. Here too, other countries have very meager stakes, with Europe and the US having 4% of polysilicon capacities, South Korea and Japan with 1% capacity, and other regions with the remaining 4%. In the case of silicon wafers, China, which had control over 72% of the global production capacity, has now increased to a whopping 99% as of 2022, with the remaining 1% capacity mostly located in other Asian countries. But China didn't just stop here. In terms of cell manufacturing capacities, as of 2012, China controlled 50% of it. But shockingly, in 2022, this has increased to 86%, with Europe left with just 10% and other regions of the world with just around 4%. These cells, once manufactured, are assembled to get solar panels. And again, as of 2022, here too, China controls 80% of the module manufacturing capacity. China even goes further by gaining a monopoly in the inverter space too, because it's the inverter that converts DC into AC, which is the standard current. So as of 2021, China alone ships 72% of the global shipments to the world. On top of that, the creation of aluminum and steel frames that are used to mount solar panels is also concentrated in China. So now you see how deep China's hold in the solar manufacturing sector really is. But do you see the burning issue here? The entire value chain is literally dominated by a country that claims territories of other nations as its region, that bullies smaller countries for showing resistance, and openly threatens other countries to exert its own dominance. So if China decides to stop supplying or puts restrictions on the critical elements of the solar panel value chain, then countries will have no option but to buy the same equipment at much higher prices. And with the current pace at which the solar energy market is growing, the country that messes up their relationship with China either has to pay multiple millions extra to produce solar equipment, or else it would have no option but to go for the traditional options. And when I say this, I'm not just assuming these repercussions, because China has done similar things in the past. For example, take one of the battles between the US and China's tech wars. China recently restricted the exports of gallium and germanium, one of the key metals used in semiconductors and solar panels. According to this policy from August 1st, 2023, China made it mandatory for its exporters to obtain an export license to export these two metals. This made it more difficult for the exporters to supply these metals, and on the other side, it made it difficult for the manufacturers, partially in the solar and semiconductor space. Why? Because China produces 60% of the world's germanium and 80 to 90% of the world's gallium. And guess what? China announced this restriction on July 3rd, a month before it actually implemented it. But surprisingly, even before the restriction came into force, the prices of gallium shot up by 30% in just 9 days, going from around $250 to $265 per kilogram at the start of July to around $302 to $360 per kilogram on July 12th. This was the perfect example of how China uses its dominance to retaliate against someone who opposes it. So considering these situations, you can assume that no country would like to mess with China, right? But the question still remains the same. Despite so many technologically advanced nations and other major economies in the world, how did China manage to gain such a significant dominance in an important space like solar energy? I mean, this obviously wasn't like the Chinese elections, where you just have one party as an option to vote for. Companies from other countries were also free to compete in this space. In fact, other countries were also doing well in this space. For example, in 2005, Europeans were leading the solar manufacturing race, with Germany accounting for 1/5 of global solar manufacturing. By 2010, while Europe installed 8 out of every 10 solar panels in the world, it produced only 1. Now in 2023, China will make 8 out of every 10 solar panels worldwide and add 5 of those to its grid and export most of the remaining ones. So the question is, why did other countries fail when China succeeded? This is where the master plan of China comes in. It wasn't just Chinese companies who did it alone. Both Chinese companies and the Chinese government worked together to achieve this monopoly. They did this not just for the value chain of solar panels, but also for EV batteries and, later on, EVs themselves. So, there are multiple reasons why Chinese manufacturers have an edge over manufacturers from other countries. This edge over other players in the industry would stay with China for the next several years, or even decades in unfortunate cases. The reasons for China's remarkable success in this field are the same reasons as those that have made it the leading manufacturing hub worldwide. These are low-cost capital, rapid regulatory approvals, protection from foreign competition, low labor costs, an unparalleled network of suppliers, and fast-growing domestic demand. Also, Chinese manufacturers benefited from subsidies and very advantageous electricity prices in some regions. So the government's support has played a pivotal role in the thriving of the solar industry. For example, in December of 2020, China removed restrictions on PV glass production because the demand for PV glass, or photovoltaic glass, was skyrocketing. But due to the restrictions imposed on the amount of glass that could be produced, the supply was very low. As a result, the spot prices of glass, meaning the current prices at which the glass can be bought or sold at a particular place in time, started skyrocketing, reaching from $3.2 per square meter in Q2 of 2020 to almost $7 per square meter in the fourth quarter of 2020. But once the restrictions were lifted in December of 2020, glass prices started decreasing and hit a bottom of almost $3 per square meter in the second quarter of 2021, and from then onwards has stabilized to around $4 per square meter. Achieving dominance in polysilicon production was a challenge for China. This was because polysilicon production requires heavy chemical industrial processes, which require complex technical knowledge. Reaching high purity levels in manufacturing is also challenging. This is the reason why this step in the solar value chain was the last one China targeted as part of its strategy to reach industrial independence in the solar manufacturing space. For a long time, a Germany-based company, Wacker Chemie, was one of the top suppliers in the world, because they had the technical know-how in this space. In fact, in a 2004 report, I found no Chinese companies even in the top 7 polysilicon manufacturers, and the first 2 spots were secured by a US company, Hemlock, and the German Wacker Chemie, respectively. In fact, in 2016, Wacker Chemie AG even became the world's largest manufacturer of polysilicon and maintained the top spot till 2019. Fast forward to 2022, the top 4 players in polysilicon are from China. And Wacker Chemie, the company that once held the top spot, slipped to the 5th spot. And the US manufacturer Hemlock slipped to the 9th spot. The question is, how did China achieve this? This is where the story of the Chinese firm Global Concord Group Limited, or GCL, comes into the picture. This Chinese firm was one of the top polysilicon manufacturers in the world. But as the tech of solar panels evolved, the demand for polysilicon of higher purity began to rise in 2015. And Germany's Wacker Chemie was perfectly placed to benefit from this demand. But then China's GCL did something crazy to beat the German giant. GCL, which was already a polysilicon manufacturer, decided to manufacture polysilicon of higher purity. Because earlier, like most of the Chinese firms, it was producing low quality and less pure polysilicon. But in 2018, GCL built a new 48,000 MT capacity polysilicon plant in the Xinjiang province of China. This new polysilicon plant had been designed to produce high purity material. On top of that, the Chinese state-owned entity, China Development Bank Corporation, decided to provide financial support to GCL. According to an agreement signed between them in June of 2011, the China Development Bank decided to provide financial support to GCL's domestic and overseas investment projects in foreign currency and renminbi in the next 5 years to fulfill the capacity requirements of GCL for its future development. Also, by obtaining electricity from a nearby coal-fired power plant at a very low tariff, GCL was able to produce the required polysilicon at much lower costs in Xinjiang than it did in other regions. This is because electricity prices play a critical role in polysilicon manufacturing. After all, electricity accounts for 40% of polysilicon's production cost. This is the reason why the average electricity prices are $75 per megawatt hour, which is almost 30% below the global average. Now, this is not too environmentally friendly for China, because coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, accounts for 77% of power generation in the Xinjiang region, where the most energy-intensive step in the solar panel manufacturing process, polysilicon refining, is concentrated. This consumption of coal in China led to 30% more greenhouse gas emissions compared to if this supply chain were in the US. So even though China is making something that would protect the environment, the method of production in China in itself is not very environmentally friendly. But anyways, this worked for China. Considering other factors, we shouldn't forget the labor costs in China. The average labor costs in China are around $6, while in the US it is around $25 to $30, and in Europe it's around $33. It's not just costs. Chinese factories also work to improve their efficiency and reduce costs. For example, they used new tools to slice thinner polysilicon wafers with less waste, thus producing more solar cells from the same amount of raw material. This innovation alone helped lower costs by 80%. All these factors, particularly cheap electricity prices, made China's Xinjiang province the hub of polysilicon manufacturing. As of 2022, Xinjiang alone accounts for around 40% of global polysilicon manufacturing. This is the reason why polysilicon made outside of China is priced at $7 to $10 per kilogram higher than Chinese polysilicon. It's equivalent to about double the price. As a result of these cheap prices, most of these solar panel manufacturers prefer Chinese polysilicon because this decreases their module manufacturing costs by 10 to 20%. So subsidies, subsidized energy prices, and government support to Chinese companies made China the most dominant player in the polysilicon space. And as we saw, it controls 86% of the global polysilicon manufacturing capacity as of 2022. Similarly, other Chinese companies like Trina Solar, Suntech, and LONGi Green Energy Technology Company are a few of the examples that became one of the biggest players in the solar manufacturing space. LONGi Green Energy Technology Company is another monopoly, but in wafer production. This company has a similar story as almost every other Chinese manufacturer. It started in 2000, initially importing expensive silicon to manufacture solar cells, and later decided to develop its own monocrystalline wafers production by getting on the government subsidies. Currently, LONGi Green Energy Technology Company is the world's largest producer of solar wafers, manufacturing 1 out of every 4 wafers produced globally. China also made sure its companies survived even in times of crisis. For example, when companies started failing after the 2008 recession, a Chinese state-owned bank, China Development Bank or CDB, provided $43.2 billion to 15 solar companies in 2010, which supported them despite global uncertainty. State credit was also used to upgrade capabilities through continued capacity expansion or acquisition. It also provided a second round of lending in 2012 to ensure that its big players like Trina Solar and Suntech stayed in business. On top of that, about 10% of funding to China's national R&D programs was allocated just to energy research. Also, state and local governments provided funds to national programs, not only to develop new technologies, but also to commercialize and export it. Taking advantage of these incentives, the leading solar companies started to engage in their R&D to upgrade their products and production. In another case, China was importing expensive raw materials like silicon for solar manufacturing. But later, Chinese companies received support from favorable government policies to produce raw silicon locally. And later, the CCP's Ministry of Science and Technology especially mentioned the development of silicon refinement technology in its 11th five-year plan, which was from 2006 to 2010. Additionally, China has spent more than $50 billion in loans and tax incentives in the solar manufacturing space. This is how the Chinese companies and their governments work together in the solar manufacturing space. But every coin has two sides, and in this case, it's the supply and the demand side. So China also made sure to keep up with the demand side. One of the major and earliest programs was the 1996 Brightness Program, which was an international effort designed to bring electricity to rural areas. This was introduced during the 1996 World Solar Peak Conference in Zimbabwe. China aimed to provide wind and solar-generated electricity to around 23 million people living in remote areas. Since then, China's State Council has allocated around $50 million, or around 400 million Chinese yuan, in its fifth five-year plan period, which was from 2001 to 2005, to support the Brightness Program. Another project called the Township Electrification Program, which was worth 2 billion Chinese yuan, was implemented from 2001 to 2003 and was aimed at electrifying more than 1,000 towns in remote areas using renewable energy sources like solar, wind, or hybrid systems. Similar projects added to the demand side and made sure that Chinese manufacturers don't just rely on exports. Additionally, the feed-in tariffs, where the government was itself buying power from these solar developers at guaranteed prices. So price fluctuations didn't affect these solar power producers since they were always getting fixed prices. Considering all the government support, solar installations went crazy, from just 2.5 gigawatts of cumulative installation in 2011 to around 130 gigawatts in 2018. So in this case, the government itself became the consumer. Although China has been reducing feed-in tariffs and slashing other subsidies to a great extent since 2017 and 2018. But anyway, these subsidies did their job and made China the largest consumer of solar energy. As of 2022, China has 37.5% of the world's solar energy installed capacity. This equation of demand and supply increased the demand for solar panels, and as a result, it decreased the price of solar panels to a large extent. And this helped Chinese companies beat other solar companies in the pricing of solar modules. For example, according to a report, a solar module made in China is half the price of that made in Europe, and 65% less than that made in the US. And in the case of EVs, China did the same. It incentivized both the manufacturers and the buyers in China. But in the case of EVs, there's one critical component that can literally make or break an EV maker, no matter how big or small. The critical component I'm talking about is the EV battery, and the supply chain of the materials used in it. So, just like the traditional vehicle industry is dependent on the supply chain of crude oil, the EV industry is dependent on batteries. You may ask why EV batteries are such a big deal. This is because the battery used in EVs alone makes up around 35 to 50% of the cost of the vehicle. Further, if we open up the battery and have a look at the most important components, we have the anode, the cathode, and the electrolyte that separates the anode and the cathode. In this, the cathode alone makes up around 51% of the cost of the battery. The cathode contains metals like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. The anode on the other side makes up 12% of the cost of the battery and contains graphite. Electric cars use about 6 times more rare minerals than conventional cars because of the battery in them. And China gets to decide who gets the minerals first and at what price. Now, why am I saying this? Well, you'll understand in just a few minutes. Because this is a story of absolute control, a story of global dominance. This is the arena of geopolitics. Out of the metals required to make the battery, lithium and cobalt are the most important of all. Out of the 118 elements in the periodic table, lithium and cobalt are crucial for EV batteries because they are perfectly compatible for ensuring the efficiency of the batteries. This is for 3 major reasons. Number 1, if we look at the periodic table, lithium is the lightest metal of all, placed just below hydrogen and helium. Number 2, lithium-ion batteries are 95% efficient, as compared to the 80 to 85% in the case of lead-acid batteries. This allows the battery to charge faster and have a more effective battery capacity. Number 3, a lithium-ion battery can hold 3 to 8 times more energy as compared to a lead-acid battery. A lead-acid battery can generally hold 30 to 50 watt-hours per kilogram, whereas lithium-ion battery stores 150 to 250 watt-hours per kilogram. In the case of cobalt, it is a complementary material to lithium, because cobalt enhances the energy density of lithium-ion batteries, which translates to longer driving ranges and improved performance for electric vehicles. Secondly, cobalt provides a high thermal stability, since it has a high melting point of 1,493 degrees Celsius. So cobalt, offering high heat capacity, contributes to battery safety. Overall, lithium-ion batteries are the most efficient as compared to other battery types, and so are the most preferred option over other batteries when it comes to EVs. This means that the countries with these natural resources are playing a critical role by supplying these metals. In the case of lithium, Australia, Chile, China, and Argentina are the top producers of lithium. These 4 countries alone are responsible for more than 90% of the lithium supply in the world, with Australia being the world leader, with a production total of a whopping 86,000 metric tons as of 2023. This is so huge that the production of the next 3 largest producers, Chile, Argentina, and China, combined, only match Australia's production numbers. In the case of cobalt, an African country called the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC, alone accounted for 73% of global cobalt production as of 2022. And this quantity was around 145,000 tons. Cobalt production from every other country combined just makes up around 52,855 tons, which is not even half of the DRC's production. So, the DRC has played and will play a critical role in the future as well, because the EV revolution is going to further drive the demand for cobalt, which is forecasted to more than double to 3,888,000 tons by 2030. So, since Australia and the DRC are the top producers of these metals, they must have made a lot of money selling batteries to EV companies, and they must be leaders in battery manufacturing, right? Well, there's a twist. Have a look at this chart. As of 2022, China controls about 77% of the global lithium-ion battery production capacity. Poland and the US have 6% each, and the remaining 11% go to other countries. A Chinese company named Contemporary Amperex Technology Limited, or CATL, alone controls around 34% market share as of 2022. They provide lithium-ion batteries to almost all the big players like Tesla, Puget, Hyundai, Honda, BMW, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Volvo. CATL isn't the only one. 6 out of the 10 largest EV battery-producing companies are Chinese. Now you may ask, where's Australia on this list? It's the highest lithium producer. If not first and second, it must be at least in the top 5. Well, surprisingly, Australia is in the 10th spot, with a share of just 0.1% as of 2021. So why is the top lithium producer not the top battery producer? And most importantly, how did China become the top producer? This is where China played its genius move and ensured that it controlled the mines of these metals, even if they're not present in China.
If the Congo is the dark heart of Africa, then this must surely be its deepest pit. In the bowels of the earth, men dig through the mud for gold. This country is endowed in minerals, copper, uranium, diamonds, and cobalt, and China is after it.
On the 17th of September 2007, China signed a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with the DRC, which at the time was labeled as the deal of the century. This was a $9 billion deal, under which Chinese companies received access to cobalt and copper mining rights in the DRC for 25 years. In return, China agreed to finance multiple transportation and social infrastructure projects like railways, hospitals, and universities, which were to be funded by China's Exim Bank. So basically, China said, hey, give us the rights to mine copper and cobalt in your country, and we'll provide you with a loan of $9 billion, but not in cash. Our companies will build infrastructure projects worth $9 billion in your country, and then you reimburse the loan amount from the profits from the mining operations. Under the agreement, China was to receive about 10 million tons of copper and about 600,000 metric tons of cobalt, both of these having an estimated value of $50 billion. For the mining operations, a joint venture was formed between the Congolese state mining company Geka Mines and a group of Chinese state-owned enterprises. This joint venture is collectively known as the Sino-Congolese Mines, or what the world popularly knows it as the SICO Mines Agreement. In this, the DRC Geka Mines retained a 32% stake, and the group of Chinese companies had the majority with a 68% stake. There is a lot of debate on whether this agreement was fair for the already debt-laden Congo. There were a lot of bribery allegations on Congo's top leadership. But either way, China got access to one of the most important materials, cobalt. Later, China aggressively went on to either acquire more mines or increase its stakes in the mines in the DRC. For example, Tenke-Fungurume, one of the largest copper-cobalt mines in the DRC, was once owned and operated by U.S. mining company Freeport-McMoRan Incorporated. But in 2016, a Chinese mining firm, China Molybdenum Company, or China Moly, acquired a 56% stake from Freeport and later increased it to 80% in 2019. But considering the rising demand, China Moly announced an investment of $2.5 billion in August of 2021 to almost double the copper and cobalt production from the same mine. This move was expected to increase the average annual copper output by 200,000 tons and cobalt output by 17,000 tons. China Moly acquired a 95% stake for $550 million in 2020 in another copper-cobalt mine in the Congo, just 20 miles away from the Tenke-Fungurume mine. In this case, it didn't acquire this stake from the Congolese government, but rather from the same U.S. company, Freeport-McMoRan Incorporated. So, as of 2024, 95% stake in this new mine is owned by China Moly, and the DRC government holds the remaining 5%. According to reports, this mine holds around 3.1 million tons of cobalt and 6.28 million tons of copper. Similarly, another Chinese corporation, Huayu Cobalt, owns or has a stake in at least 3 copper-cobalt mines in the DRC. So fast forward to 2022. Out of the 19 cobalt operations in the DRC, 15 are now either owned or co-owned by Chinese entities. These Chinese companies also have the backing of Chinese state-owned banks to support them financially. In fact, the 5 largest Chinese mining corporations mining cobalt and copper in the Congo have access to credit lines from Chinese state banks totaling an astounding $124 billion. This basically means that these mining corporations can borrow money from these banks up to the specified credit limit. So, because of nature's gift to the DRC, 70% of the world's cobalt is mined in the DRC, and 80% of that is then headed to China for processing. But cobalt has a problem. Although the Congo has been blessed with natural resources, this same blessing has turned into a curse for many Congolese citizens.
Some 200,000 miners work in these mines. At least 40,000 of them are children, some as young as 6. These children flirt with death daily. They enter vertical tunnels. Most of them are too narrow for adults to enter. Inside, it's like a furnace. The children dig for cobalt under inhuman conditions.
The DRC has some of the weakest labor laws in the world. As a result, they have a terrible record on working conditions and child labor. Human rights abuses and child labor are major issues in the Congo's mining sector. These concerns regarding human rights abuses and child labor became the most important reason for companies all over the world to reduce the cobalt content in batteries, and also partly as a way to avoid the legal and reputational risks. So one of the best replacements for cobalt was nickel. Now, although completely eliminating cobalt isn't an option, many battery manufacturers across the world have decreased cobalt content significantly. A few of the battery manufacturers even managed to produce cathodes for batteries with 80% nickel and only 10% cobalt. So any country with nickel has hit a gold mine. If we see where the majority of nickel is found, it's Indonesia, with 55 million metric tons of nickel as of 2023. This means the world has finally found a spot in the battery manufacturing supply chain where they don't have to rely on China. Right? Actually, the reality is far different. Because Chinese companies control a huge chunk of the nickel in Indonesia. The same Chinese companies that dominate cobalt mining in the DRC, which are Huayu Cobalt and China Moly, are also heavily invested in nickel extraction and processing in Indonesia. Interestingly, the world's largest nickel producer is China's Tsingshan Holding Group, which has a significant portion of its operations based in Indonesia. This has made China the largest global market producer of nickel, beating competition from Europe and the USA. Now, in the case of lithium, the most important element in an EV battery, China produces a significant amount of lithium because they have a significant amount of lithium present in China itself. In 2023, China produced 33,000 metric tons of lithium, ranking 3rd among the top lithium producers globally. However, this amount is insufficient for China to maintain its position as the world's leading battery manufacturer. So, just like other materials, Chinese companies even control some of the biggest lithium mines present outside of China. For example, Chinese mining company Tianqi Lithium acquired a 51% stake in Greenbushes mine, the world's biggest hard rock lithium mine present in Australia. This same company is also the second largest shareholder in a Chilean mining company called SQM. China's Ganfeng Lithium holds a 51% stake in Argentina's lithium project, and Chinese companies are also spending $1.4 billion to build lithium extraction plants in Bolivia and several other lithium projects in the lithium-rich nation. This is how China controls the mines, even though they are not present in China. This doesn't mean Western countries don't own mines abroad, it's just that they are more reluctant to put money into countries with unstable governments or poor labor practices. Basically what we saw in the case of the Congo. Even now, in the case of the anode of the battery, China has the upper hand, because the majority of the anode is made up of graphite, and graphite is mostly mined in China. On the other hand, US producers synthesize graphite at a much greater cost. This is how China controls most of the supply of metals required for making batteries. But the story doesn't end here. When I dug deeper to study battery manufacturing more precisely, I found something absolutely astounding. You see, although China controls some critical mines in Australia, Australia still has control over most of its mines, and it could sell this lithium to the world. But surprisingly, Australia first sells its lithium to China, and then China sells lithium to the world. And as of 2023, Australia shipped around 98% of its lithium to China. But isn't this stupid? Why is Australia selling it to China instead of selling it directly to the world or making EV batteries internally? I found the answer to this question in what Elon Musk said in 2022. Elon Musk once said, "Getting into the lithium refining business is like a license to print money." He also mentioned that mining is relatively easy, the refining is much harder. Now, to understand why he said that, we need to understand the supply chain of an EV battery. The lithium we mine cannot be used directly for making EV batteries. It must be refined into battery-grade materials before it's ready to use in batteries. If we see the supply chain, it consists of 4 major parts: mining, refining, making cell components and battery cells, and assembly. Mining is already dominated by China, but the surprise is yet to come. When it comes to refining capabilities, China refines 60% of the world's lithium and 80% of the world's lithium hydroxide. Other countries are lagging behind China due to various reasons that include the tech, investments needed to refine lithium, and a huge amount of energy. In fact, the metals used in batteries require 3 to 4 times as much energy to refine as steel or copper. But Chinese refining companies are supported by the government with cheap land and energy, so they're able to refine minerals at larger volumes and lower costs than everyone else. Refining also causes a lot of pollution. But again, China has less stringent environmental regulations. In fact, the environment is such a critical factor that it has even resulted in protests and backlash against refining companies in many countries, including Australia. But in China, you can't protest. So now you know why Australia sells almost all of its lithium to China and not directly to the world. This isn't just for lithium, though. Most of the raw materials are shipped to China to be refined, and it has equally destructive effects on the environment. For example, for every pound of refined cobalt powder produced, around 860 pounds of rock waste is produced. Similarly, processing nickel also generates a lot of toxic waste. When it comes to manufacturing lithium-ion batteries, China has megafactories that manufacture these lithium batteries at scale. And out of the world's 200 lithium-ion battery megafactories in the pipeline, 148 of them are located in China, whereas Europe and North America only have 21 and 11 megafactories in the pipeline, respectively. This is how China alone produces 75% of all lithium-ion batteries used worldwide. But isn't this kind of dumb on China's part? I mean, it's foolish to take on all the burden to make batteries. After all, we can just focus on recycling. I bet most of you have heard of battery recycling. This is revolutionary because it is not like oil where the product will get completely extinguished. I mean, this sounds brilliant, right? But there's a problem. It's the technology and infrastructure required for it. As of December of 2023, China led the world in battery recycling capacity, with a capacity of more than 500,000 metric tons, as compared to the US and Europe with around 200,000 metric tons of capacity each. On top of that, according to a report, by 2030, more than 66% of wasted electric vehicle batteries are expected to be recycled in China. In fact, Chinese EV manufacturer BYD has also developed a recycling process that can recover up to 90% of the materials used in the battery. So even the recycling is dominated by China. So, long story short, China clearly dominates the EV battery value chain from top to bottom. So, now that China has mastered and dominated battery technology, it has become easier for Chinese EV makers to build EVs at much lower costs. Most of the Chinese EV giants like BYD make EV batteries in-house. And unlike other car makers who expanded to build electric models, BYD was initially a battery company that later started making cars. And because the batteries are the most expensive part of an EV, making them in-house saves BYD a ton of money, and they can sell EVs at a much lower cost. Global competitors, on the other hand, including Tesla, rely on third-party manufacturers for batteries, which increases the cost of their products. For example, BYD's entry-level EV, the Seagull, is priced at around $11,000. Tesla, on the other hand, introduced a Model 3 sedan in China with a starting price of nearly $36,000. Maybe this is why Mr. Buffett has invested more than $230 million in BYD. Similarly, the average price of an electric vehicle in China as of 2022 was $27,000, whereas in Europe it was over $40,500, and in the US it is over $54,000. The same is the case with the cars the Chinese sell in Europe. Its average prices are 25% lower as compared to its European rivals. The result? 1 in every 5 EVs sold in Europe is a Chinese import. And this even includes cars of non-Chinese brands like BMW and Tesla, which have manufacturing facilities in China. So, China mastered EV batteries and EV cars by giving incentives and support to both the Chinese people and the EV manufacturers. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, China spent more than $130 billion on research incentives, government contracts, and other consumer subsidies. On top of that, electric car buyers in China get tax rebates, cheaper vehicle registration, preferential parking, and access to an extensive charging network. As of 2022, China had nearly 1.8 million publicly accessible electric vehicle chargers, making it home to the largest public charging infrastructure globally. As we know, China exports a lot of these cars, and tariffs play an important role in deciding the price of a car. In the case of Europe, they have a standard 10% tariff on almost every imported car. But despite these tariffs, the Chinese still have their 25 to 30% cost advantage. And so Europeans still found it cheaper to buy Chinese cars instead of European cars. But this might change soon, and Chinese car makers could lose a chunk of the European market. This is because, according to EU officials, Chinese companies were receiving unfair subsidies from the Chinese government, which made it difficult for European car makers to compete with their Chinese counterparts. If China is found guilty, the EU could impose tariffs on Chinese cars above the standard 10% EU rate. But where's the US in this game? Because I haven't even mentioned the US anywhere, and there's a good reason for that. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed a 25 plus 2.5% tariff on Chinese-made cars. So basically, a 2.5% tariff is generally applied to every imported car. But an additional 25% has been imposed on Chinese cars, making it a total tariff of 27.5%. This was done to protect US manufacturers from cheap Chinese cars that were flooding into the US. This tariff has killed the 25 to 30% cost advantage that Chinese car makers had. And as a result, China completely lost its competitiveness in the American market, and Chinese auto companies currently have a very limited presence in the US, as of now. So does this mean that China has given up on the huge market of the US? Of course not. China, very cunningly, has set up manufacturing bases outside of China to evade tariffs, because then these vehicles technically won't have the Made in China tag. So cars made at the Chinese-owned factory in Mexico would only face the 2.5% standard tariff. But even this move is closely monitored by the USA. Similar to EVs is the case of Chinese-made solar panels. The US has imposed tariffs on them. The US did this because of the surge of cheap solar panels from China destroying US manufacturers. After all, cheap Chinese imports forced 4 US solar manufacturers to seek bankruptcy protection. So, 2012, Obama imposed duties as high as 249% on Chinese imports. But even in this case, China found a way to evade the more than a decade-old tariff on imports. According to the US Commerce Department, China directed its supply chains through factories in Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The US already probed this case and could take necessary action later. Even in the case of India, Chinese investments worth billions were blocked by India several times. India did this to protect domestic manufacturing and, well, because of geopolitical reasons. So, it's great. Everyone is containing China, right? Whether it's the US, Europe, or India, or any other major economy, they are pushing back against China. Well, no, actually. Let's just accept the bitter truth. Although countries are trying to break China's dominance, the supply chains of EVs and solar cells are completely dominated by China. So at this point, the world needs China. Sadly, that's the truth. But now, does this mean that the world is just letting go of the future of solar and EV production to China completely? Well, the answer is also no. The world has taken some crucial measures to reduce the dependency on China in the solar and EV supply chain. In February of 2023, India struck gold. India found 5.9 million tons of lithium in its Jammu and Kashmir state. This was significant because this discovery made India the 7th largest source of lithium globally. Potential reserves could also be present in other Indian states. And India is likely to start working on lithium exploration soon. Although these things are at very nascent stages, the world has another huge proven source of lithium without Chinese control. When it comes to producing lithium-ion cells, which is an important part of the supply chain, European companies are also beginning to gain on China's lead. According to a report, by 2030, Europe is expected to have 28 factories producing lithium-ion cells, with an increased production capacity by 1,440% from 2020 levels. Australia, an important player in the supply chain, has blocked the acquisition of Alita Resources, Australia's local lithium producer, by a Chinese company. Similarly, Australia blocked the Chinese acquisition of another company called Northern Minerals, and it had several such earlier cases too. On top of that, the Australian government has already put hundreds of millions of dollars towards supporting the lithium refining industry. A report in 2022 forecasted that 20% of global lithium refining could take place in Australia by 2027, which is currently less than 1% as of 2023. As we know, refining is an extremely critical part of the EV supply chain. The US, on the other hand, came up with something called the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. One of the key goals of the act is to reduce carbon emissions by around 40% by 2030. This might sound like a Greta Thunberg speech, but it has some very important provisions to tackle China. The IRA provides tax incentives, estimated to add up to $30 billion over the next decade, to encourage the manufacturing of solar modules, wind turbines, inverters, and batteries for electric vehicles, and the refining of critical minerals in the US. Another $20 billion will finance loans that will be issued by the Department of Energy to support domestic EV manufacturing. Finally, the investment tax credit, another $10 billion, will incentivize the building of EV, wind turbine, and solar panel factories. On top of that, it offers loans or subsidies to companies in countries like Australia that have a free trade agreement with the United States. So, refining lithium would also allow Australia to tap into the Inflation Reduction Act. This act taps into de-risking both the solar as well as the EV. More good news is that solar and EV tech are new technologies and are evolving fast. We will see rapid innovation in them. The reason I'm saying this is because a US company, First Solar, produced the cadmium telluride panels. And the best part about this innovation is that they do not require polysilicon and have a lower environmental impact. Now, only time will tell whether the world will be able to tackle China or not.